It's no secret that fight scenes are hard to write. You could almost say, fight scenes are complicated. There are kind of two dimensions to writing fight scenes. The macro, broader things like structure and overall place in the narrative, and the micro, the sentence by sentence or word by word writing of a fight scene in a book. And it's this part that doesn't get nearly enough attention. There's already a lot of content out there about the macro of a fight scene, because the same rules apply in TV and film. So we'll be examining the micro of fight scenes from these 13 books to understand how to write a good fight scene on that level. However, the macro is still really important to understand. And best-selling author of the Shadow Shaper series, Daniel Jose Older's Skillshare class on writing standout opening scenes is a good place to start. After all, it's not uncommon to start stories with some kind of fight scene, and his discussion of the microcosm of a scene, character action, and driving questions is a great framework regardless. So consider it complimentary to today's video, and you can watch it entirely for free for 2 months over on today's sponsor, Skillshare, all at the links down below. Let's get down to business. Long or short sentences. So the first piece of advice you'll be given when you look into writing fight scenes is write shorter sentences. And I want you to know that, little secret, coming close, this is bullcrap. Let me spill the tea. It is true that some stories do use shorter sentences to better reflect the quick back and forth of a fight scene. Lee Child writes the Jack Reacher action stories and uses short sentences to never let a moment linger. These aren't even complete sentences, like tightened his finger, which lacks the grammatical subject he, as if complete thoughts aren't possible in a tense moment like a fight. R.F. Kuang employs a similar technique in The Poppy War, where shorter sentences reflect the brutal and sharp movements of martial arts. These shorter sentences are usually focused on a strong verb without many adjectives or other framing. He struck her face once, twice, thrice. But not only do these fight scenes have a lot of long sentences as well, but the majority of fight scenes don't shorten their sentences enough for you to take this as some kind of clear and applicable advice or rule. And that's because it's less about sentence length and more about how the individual fight beats are short. Consider the sentence in Blake Crouch's Dark Matter. I slam into the hardwood floor, the back of my head hitting so hard I see bursts of light, and then he's on top of me, blood dripping off his ruined face, one hand squeezing my throat. Here, there are 4 distinct beats that happen in quick succession. Slam, hitting, is on top of, squeezing. There are far more verb beats than in your average sentence, which usually only have 1 or 2. And that each of these are really short gives the feeling of it being fast-paced, of high tension. And placing these actions in the same sentence makes it feel faster because there's no full stop between them, breaking these actions up, like there's barely a moment to breathe. And compare this with Rowling's writing in The Order of the Phoenix.
Dumbledore brandished his wand in one long, fluid movement. The snake, which had been an instant from sinking its fangs into him, flew high into the air and vanished in a wisp of dark smoke. The water in the pool rose up and covered Voldemort like a cocoon of molten glass.
Once again, speed and tension isn't about sentence length, it's about action beats taking as little time as possible. Brandishing, sinking, flew, vanished, rose, and covered. A hell of a lot happens in a single sentence here, each beat just a handful of words. So, let your sentences be short or long, but make each action beat very short, using a chain of strong verbs that allow the reader to follow the fight beats as fast as they would take to happen. For example, this scene in the film actually takes just a little bit longer to happen than it does to read aloud. Part 2. Cause and effect. Having a series of verbs in quick succession does not an interesting fight make. Saying Marwyn kicked his opponent, then thrust his fist into a punch, dodging left and cutting up with his elbow into his enemy's jaw is a sentence of quick verb succession, but it is A, not interesting, or B, easy to follow. This is because there is no strong relationship of cause and effect between these verbs. What you'll notice is that whether using short or long sentences, good fight scene writing also has a strong feeling of cause and effect, moving from one verb to the other. Take this passage in James S.A. Corey's Leviathan Wakes.
Holden shook violently in his restraints, and then slapped back into his chair as Alex took the Rocky through a series of sudden maneuvers, and then slammed down the throttle to evade the last of the PDC fire.
Shook, slapped, slammed, and evade. Each of these 4 quick succession verbs don't just follow one another, but they have a strong relationship of causing each other. Holden shakes and slaps back into his chair because they are accelerating and evading. This makes it a lot easier to follow for the reader because it gives the fight scene a sense of chronology on a sentence-by-sentence basis. In contrast with this, kicked, thrust, dodge, and cut, the sentence lacks any strong feeling of causation, making each movement feel ultimately pointless in its own way. You could take one out or put them in any order and it wouldn't really make a difference, would it? So look for where those sentences are in your work. But in framing your cause and effect verb chains, there are particular sentence patterns that I've noticed a lot of writers use, a common one being react, pause, act. Consider this fight scene in Martin's A Game of Thrones.
And it must be said of Sir Vardus Egan that he was true to his lady's command, even to the last. One moment he was reeling backward, half crouched behind his scarred shield. The next, he charged. The sudden bull rush caught Bronn off balance.
It's all centered around that second sentence: react, reeling, pause, crouched, act, charged. Likewise, in Sanderson's Skyward, when Spencer is being chased through the air by the enemy, I cut my acclivity ring, spun on my axis, then overburned right back downward. React, cut, pause, spun, act, overburned. These patterns maintain that sense of cause and effect and chronology, while also giving a variety of pacing to the fight scene. The react, pause, act framework means the character isn't repetitively doing the same thing in different words: kicked, punched, thrust, and so on. They're changing tactics, considering surroundings, and being active. A second verb pattern includes goal, conflict, disaster. Grabbing his head, I bring my knee back for another blow, but he sweeps my left leg out from under me. Goal, grabbing, conflict, bring, and disaster, sweep. It's a simple, fast-paced sentence model that serves a different purpose here. React, pause, act sentences give a sense of moving towards the goal, while the goal, conflict, disaster feels like it's moving away from the character's goal, meaning you can use these pretty effectively together to give a real rhythm to the fight scene. Though not in a single sentence, this scene from Sanderson's Skyward follows these two patterns put together. I got in close and speared the Krell ship with my light lance, then I turned, pulling the Krell ship out of line with Bog. The cockpit trembled around me, sending us both into a frantic, out-of-control spin. Goal, conflict, disaster. Then, I cut my acclivity ring, spun on my axis, then overburned right back downward. React, pause, act. They work together really well. But don't think of these as rigid rules, but what they are: patterns and suggestions. Be creative with your sentence length, the number of verb segments you have, and remember that the cause-effect relationship is really what's most important to clarity and rhythm. In other words, fight scenes are complicated! Even so, you've got to admit that this does have a nice flow to read. Part 3. Where should you give detail? While using the cause-effect structure and those verb patterns will help, those alone don't make the fight well-paced. You don't need to describe every moment of the fight in equal detail. No, I offer that there are 3 main types of moments where the fight is described in that close detail like we've been discussing. The first is when there is a shift in the balance of power. Consider this fight in Almakatsu's The Hunger.
Before Stanton could pull his gun from its holster, the man tackled him, knocking him to the ground. The whirling sand obscured details and made Stanton feel as though he were wrestling a faceless phantasm, one, however, who reeked of whiskey. Stanton managed to jerk aside when the man plunged a fist toward his face and heard a knife blade strike loose sand beside him. They rolled over and over in the sand, scrabbling for advantage, fighting not just each other, but the wind, a giant hand hurling them through the dark. He caught the man good in the ribs, though, and heard him cry out. And then Stanton was sure he recognized the voice. Louis Keseberg.
There are 3 distinctly described moments in this fight here. In the first, it's the inciting incident of the fight that shifts the balance of power against Stanton. In the second, a knife is introduced, raising the stakes and shifting the balance further. And finally, in the third, Stanton retakes power and learns the identity of his attacker. All of these shift that balance of power. But the more important phrase here is they rolled over and over in the sand, scrabbling for advantage. Here, nothing specific is described, but the reader still gets the idea of what is happening: two men wrestling over a knife in the dirt. Why though? The reason nothing is described here is that there is no shift in the balance of power. However, some fight scenes are not actually based around struggles in power, but non-combat goals, like how in The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, Salander is trying to free Blomkvist at the same time as she is fighting. Instead of shifts in power, it's the moments where she gets closer or further away from that goal that are described in that close detail, because that's where the tension is drawn from in the scene. This is particularly common in the horror genre, where it's very common that one character is wholly overpowering the other, who is just trying to escape or grab a weapon, that non-combat goal. So keep in mind the genre and what your characters are actually trying to do. The second type of moment where authors add that close detail is in moments of character importance. Let's take a look at R.F. Kuang's The Poppy War.
The next time Nistya lunged at her, she pulled him to the floor with her. They rolled around in the dirt, each attempting to pin the other, and failing. He punched madly in the air, flinging blows haphazardly at her face. She dodged the first one. He swung his fist back in reverse and caught her with a backhand that left her gasping. The lower half of her face went numb. He'd slapped her. He'd slapped her. A kick she could take, a knife hand strike she could absorb, but that slap had a savage intimacy.
Like with Almakatsu's The Hunger, the moments of the fight where there is no major shift in power are generalized, with they rolled around in the dirt, each attempting to pin the other and failing. But detail is especially given to this moment where he slaps her. See, Rin grew up socially isolated and repeatedly beaten down, making the slap personally humiliating, degrading, and it changes how she fights from then on. And lastly, the third type of moment you might linger for is narrative importance, things that you really want the character or the reader to reflect on. Take this final duel between Harry Potter and Voldemort in the Deathly Hallows. This single moment is described in lengthy detail to really allow the reader to linger on it and feel the tension and cathartic release more specifically. It's purposeful. But what about the other moments that don't have these things, that we generalize? Well, let's return to them. Renowned fantasy author Brandon Sanderson discusses fight scenes in saying, "You are not writing a screenplay. If you describe a blow-by-blow fight scene in a book, no matter how well you describe it, it's going to be boring. Play to the strengths of the novel medium." Arguably, the greatest strength of a novel is the reader's imagination. That is why generalized descriptions like "they tussled on the ground for half a minute" work. The reader will likely better imagine it than you. But there are two things that you can do to give them the tools to best do that. Sebastian de Castell, author of Trader's Blade, writes, "Show the reader early on in the fight how each weapon moves through space. Make them vivid and visceral, then you're free to focus on the character's actions and reactions." This helps establish the feel and flow of the fight right at the start. One example of this is in Martin's A Storm of Swords with the duel between the Viper and the Mountain.
Oberyn's long spear jabbed. But Sir Gregor took the point on his shield, shoved it aside, and bowled back at the prince, his great sword flashing. The Dornishman spun away untouched.
This opening phrase establishes Oberon as quick and darting, and Sir Gregor as an immovable figure with slow but brutal swings. It's because of this opening to the fight that more generalized statements like this work later on. Show the way the people and weapons move and how the environment changes early on, and allow the reader to do the rest of the work. Secondly, these generalized statements are also where more creative language is used, like this.
They wrestled in the dust and blood. The Mountain had wrapped one huge arm around the prince, drawing him tight against his chest, like a lover.
This is instead of those verb patterns and chronology that we've been emphasizing, and it's because it's about creating a feeling for the fight, not high-paced clarity. So if you're looking for where to show off your unmatched metaphorical writing, it's here. And these generalized moments are important because verb after verb after verb with no creative imagery is still boring. Part 4. Making it easy to follow. More than usual scenes, fight scenes rely on the reader's understanding of space, where characters are, what's around them, and their physical options for movement. Science fiction writer Rob Wells summarized this in saying, "One of the biggest mistakes is we forget we are not a visual medium. We don't know what the room looks like, we don't know where the chairs are, so when a character picks one up to fight with it, it can come out of nowhere. You need to set us up with the setting." And when talking about space, we really need to talk about J.K. Rowling and the Department of Mysteries in the Order of the Phoenix. Seriously. So, first, Rowling establishes the space before the fight even begins, giving the reader a clear idea of how to visualize the fight when it happens. Some authors fall into the trap of describing the space during the fight, slowing the pacing immensely and making it seem a little bit convenient half the time. But instead, Rowling writes so that every spatial element that returns during the fight is set up prior.
He saw clocks gleaming from every surface, large and small, hanging in spaces between the bookcases or standing on desks ranging the length of the room.
And she returns to these spatial things when she writes, "A jet of red light hit the nearest Death Eater. He fell backwards into a grandfather clock. Hermione had crawled under the desk to get a better aim." Both the fragile clocks and the desks mentioned in that first description return in the fight scene as complicating factors, making it more interesting and keeping it easy to visualize by using these pre-established set pieces. And she does this over and over again in a really skillful way. All of this means that Rowling can focus on character and emotions during the fight because none of her words are wasted on description. See, the use of space in a fight scene is a lot like a series of Chekhov's guns. If you tell the reader that there's a cliff nearby, there's an inherent fear and expectation that someone's gonna fall. A fight is only as good as its build-up, and introducing those spatial elements beforehand creates an expectation and tension for the readers and characters. Fundamentally, if your environment is going to affect the way in which they fight, then establishing those elements beforehand is crucial and will make the fight itself better. Because of this, a really useful tool for planning fight scenes is blocking. It's a theatre term describing mapping out the movements of characters on a stage in broad strokes prior to details. Consider doing this for your fight scenes. But space plays another important role in Rowling's writing. How do you manage fights with a host of characters when writing from a limited perspective? Sirius's death is the single most important beat in this fight scene, but it's written from the perspective of a single character, Harry. Yet, it's Rowling's use of space that means the story naturally builds to this and makes it incredibly easy to follow in the chaos of numerous characters, even if it's just from Harry's perspective. She regularly reminds the reader where characters are, in particular reminding us where Sirius is 4 times before his death, moving down the steps, 10 feet from Harry, on the dais with Bellatrix, then through the archway. The other characters we don't physically follow nearly as closely, but we don't need to. We still get references to what they're doing during the fight, so it feels like they're involved, but Rowling only carefully tracks the spatial journey of characters who play crucial roles. Harry, Malfoy, Bellatrix, and Sirius. Because of this, Sirius's death atop the dais does not take us by surprise. That's where we expect him to be, and it makes it incredibly easy to visualize. Even if you're writing from a single perspective, give regular reminders to the reader where characters who play crucial roles in the fight scene story beats are. That spatial knowledge really helps with the visualization. Part 5. So, sentence structure and pacing are one thing, but word choice, that's really where you get to craft the tone and feel of your fight scene, how you describe pain and consequence to every blow. Consider how in King's horror novel The Shining, he repeatedly attaches visceral bodily descriptors to the fight.
The mallet came down again with whistling deadly velocity and buried itself in her soft stomach. Agony exploded on her right side as the mallet took her just below the line of her breasts, breaking 2 ribs. The mallet came down and landed just below her kneecap. She jerked her head away from it, and it scraped the flesh from her ear.
The dark Swedish noir, which is just to say Swedish noir, the girl with the dragon tattoo, employs a similar technique. The iron hit Martin on the collarbone near his shoulder. The blow had a terrible force, and Blomkvist heard something snap. Both authors deliberately use specific bodily descriptors to remind the reader how fragile we are, making it feel gritty, brutal, uncomfortable, and bloody. There is also a lot more emphasis on avoiding blows, because every blow lands with serious consequence. Let's contrast this with some more light-hearted fiction in Robert Jordan's The Wheel of Time series.
Without the void, he was always half a heartbeat behind, The tip of Turok's heavy sword made a stinging trench just under his left eye. A flap of coat sleeve hung away from his shoulder, the darker for being wet. The river undercuts the bank. He dropped to one knee, blades slashing across.
The descriptors here for pain and consequence are far more generalized compared to Larson and King. Though characters are hit, it's not usually devastating, and the focus isn't nearly as much on avoidance. This is a tonal choice that makes it less gritty, more interested in spectacle, which is why the prose doesn't linger on consequences in a fight too much. This is a technique employed by fiction aimed at younger audiences as well. And that's okay, it's a stylistic choice, but if you want that grittier fight, then give those more specific, visceral bodily descriptors to the harm done, and focus on evasion. The more generalized the verbs and adjectives, the less gritty the fight will be for the reader. You'll also notice that authors choose to use a wide variety of verbs in fight scenes, more so than usual. You don't use a different verb for speaking every time someone says something. But not only are different verbs what give the impression of a varied and interesting fight in these very physical scenes, but as Daniel Jose Alder asks in the Skillshare class I referenced at the beginning, what are the verbs that we use? Whatever actions that character is doing do need to be things that tell us something about who that person is. Verb choice is often where we find character in fight scenes. Part 6. Playing to the strengths of the novel medium. Hey, yeah? Hey, you know that Marvel film? Yeah? Where the guy gets powers and then he has to fight someone he has a personal relationship with? Yeah, that was cool. Oh yeah, real cool. We should do that. Yeah, we should do that, definitely. No. A great book fight scene has different strengths. We discussed before using the reader's imagination, but another tool is the subjective experience of the character. See, books have the ability to get inside the head of characters far more than visual mediums do. They have quirks, like, I see the word red rum everywhere. Oh, there it is. Consider this knife fight in Frank Herbert's Dune. Nearly 50% of it takes place inside Paul's head, weighing risks and contextualizing every move to his character journey. And you'll find the same in a lot of other stories. It's the difference between Sanderson writing, "My hand hovered as it reached for the eject lever between my legs. I would not eject. I was no coward. I was not afraid to die." And what will it do to them? Something within me asked. If you do. Screaming, I grabbed the eject lever and yanked hard. And him just writing, "My hand hovered as it reached the eject lever between my legs." Screaming, I grabbed the lever and yanked hard. The latter feels more like watching a fight scene through a camera in a visual medium, while the former is soaked in the visceral subjective experience of Spencer. The latter is still good writing, it's just lacking depth. So use the subjective experience of your characters to frame and give depth to the action. But the real question is, how do you balance this? How do you balance internalization and action? It is hard, and we got a lot to talk about. See, internal monologue during a fight is not usually just characters observing things and thinking about things. When it is, it's kind of boring. That doesn't give us the depth that we're really looking for. Stephen King only pauses the fight for Wendy to internalize that her husband is truly going to kill her, that this is life or death. Blake Crouch in Dark Matter only pauses the fight to internalize the realization that he is about to die. Rowling only pauses the fight in The Order of the Phoenix so that Harry can internalize Sirius's death. Internalization usually explores why this fight matters. Each of these give emotional weight to the action immediately happening, making the action itself more compelling. Very little internalization is emotionally neutral or lacking that emotive language. So if your characters are just internalizing observing things, it's probably not that interesting for the reader. The challenge here is show, don't tell. It's an old axiom, you've heard it before, and it really leads into the second strength of the novel medium, the 5 senses. We usually focus on sight and sound because that's what visual mediums do, but book fights use all 5 senses to help immerse their readers. That fight in The Hunger brings up how he reeked of whiskey and the sensation of swallowing a pound of grit. This gives a different kind of realism to book fight scenes than to the TV or film mediums. Consider this passage from The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo.
He was about to pass out, and the pain in his temples was almost unbearable. She turned to him and saw that his face was the color of a tomato, his eyes were open wide, and his tongue was popping out of his mouth. She stood on her toes and frantically sawed at the leather strap to get the noose off.
Now, Larson could have internalized this in saying he knew he was near death and she knew she desperately had to free him, and this kind of internalization would tell the reader why this fight matters. But instead, Larson turns those thoughts into physical movements using sight and sensation, the five senses, to capture that feeling of panic and desperation. Instead of telling the reader why it matters with this kind of internalization, he instead shows them through the physical experiences behind that idea. Fundamentally, physicalize feelings with all five senses where you can, and reserve internalization for those important story beats during the fight scene. Part 7. So you've got a better idea on how to balance internalization and action, but what about balancing it with that sweet, sweet dialogue? Almost every single one of these fights that we've looked at today has some amount of dialogue involved, but why and how? Firstly, much of it is utilitarian, short, snappy, to the point. When a fight is tense and evenly matched, characters typically only say what is needed. In the Poppy War, during that one-on-one fight between Nazar and Rin, neither of them say anything, they only need to focus. Even in Leviathan Wakes, where there is a lot of dialogue, everything is short and snappy to reflect that tense, high-paced speed of the situation, and every part of it is needed. They're a ship crew, and much of the tension comes from their ability to cooperate and communicate. But across the entire fight, there are only 3 lines longer than 2 sentences, all of which are short. If characters have the time to monologue, then things feel, well, less urgent. Secondly, dialogue in fight scenes is often emotional. The veil of courtesy and social conditioning of normal conversation is stripped back, getting to the emotion behind what the characters want to say a lot quicker. In The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, Salander only says one thing when fighting a serial rapist and killer. Do you like pain, creep? Her hatred for the guy comes through in this simple one-clause question as she hits him. It doesn't require a monologue about her traumatic past. This isn't Shakespeare. And because it's so short, it doesn't break the pacing of the scene. Thirdly, power imbalance. The character that clearly has the upper hand in the fight is the one who often speaks more. Salander, Jack Torrance, the Viper, for a while. When you try your best. Just as detail can mark shifts in power in the scene, it can also be reflected in dialogue, as them speaking is a form of them taking control of the scene. When writing dialogue in combat, keep it on average to 1 or 2 short sentences, that would be my advice, and leave behind any of the fluff of polite conversation and allow emotion to guide the words you use. But obviously, these are...
It's more what you'd call guidelines than actual rules.
And how dialogue works during a fight will really come down to your writing style and to character, who they are and their relationship with their opponent. The fight between the Viper and the Mountain is incredibly fast-paced and tense, but that doesn't stop Oberon screaming for him to confess. This is very in character for him, and the book makes a point of how much unnecessary flair he has while fighting that'll probably get him killed. And does. Maybe you want your characters to be having a philosophical debate while they fight, and that's okay, that is insanely cool. It's not necessarily realistic, but that might be your style, and a lot of readers will like that. Fiction is fiction, folks. However, there is another element to consider with both dialogue and internalization. They both allow you to control the pacing of the fight scene. They can give the reader room to breathe with a change of pace. However, too much internalization or too much dialogue does hamper the pacing as well by slowing the fight scene down and making it feel like you're watching a DVD as your sister has the remote in the other room pressing start, pause. Now, studying the micro fight scenes like we did here doesn't get nearly the attention from authors that it really needs, but the macro matters too. And you should check out author Daniel Jose Older's Skillshare class on creative writing essentials, which we quoted in today's video, which delves more into that structural, overall macro level stuff, which you can apply to your fight scenes. And the first 1,000 of you can do it entirely for free by following this link, skl.sh/HelloFutureMe2, down in the description below. You get 2 months free of Skillshare. It's for creative and curious people, which I know you are, and there is a massive variety of classes which go well beyond writing that you can take on there as well. And of course helps the channel immensely. Thank you if you do. And because it would not be a Hello Future Me video without a summary out of a Year 7 essay, let's get down to business. Firstly, whether using short or long sentences, each action beat should be short to maintain fast pacing and tension in a fight. Secondly, verb chains need a sense of cause to effect and chronology. This can be achieved with the react, pause, act, and goal, conflict, disaster structures, but these are not required. Thirdly, not every moment of a fight needs to be detailed. Detail is required where the power balance shifts, where characters get closer or further from their goal, or in important narrative or character moments. Fourthly, generalized descriptions or creative language allow the reader to get the feel and flow of the fight in non-essential moments. Fifthly, establish the space before the fight, especially set pieces that become complications in the fight later. This helps the reader follow it and assists in tension build up prior. Tracking the physical movements of characters with important story beats in the fight really helps with visualization. Sixthly, using specific bodily descriptors in describing pain and blows makes it feel grittier and more brutal. This is usually accompanied by an emphasis in the fight scene on evading blows. Seventhly, use subjective experience to give depth to the action. Internalization usually arises from exploring why a fight scene matters, and is written with emotive language. Otherwise, physicalize these thoughts with the 5 senses. Eighthly, dialogue during fight scenes is usually snappy and to the point, emotional, or reflective of a power imbalance. However, the biggest factor is your style and character. You can use dialogue and internalization to control the pacing. But in all of this, just remember, fight scenes are complicated! And a massive thank you to all my YouTube peeps who helped voicing some of the book passages for this video. You guys did absolutely fantastically. All of your channels are linked down below. And in the meantime, let me know one of your fight scenes down in the comments. It'd be cool to read some of them. Stay nerdy, and I will see you all in the future.